Hello and welcome to Visible Voices. The Visible Project is a Leeds-based initiative aimed at improving the outcomes of adults that have experienced any form of child sexual abuse. The Visible Project is made up of two equally important groups. The Strategic Steering Group, which consists of both statutory and voluntary organisations within Leeds, and the Visible Leadership Reference Group. This podcast is by Visible Leadership Reference Group that consists of people who have experienced any form of child sexual abuse, otherwise known as CSA survivors. Names may or may not be used throughout this series. This is the first part of a two-part episode on CSA and Faith organisations. In this episode, we speak with another Visible member about their own experience.
Part of the reason I'm talking about faith organizations is I've experienced a lot of them. Growing up in care, I had Lutheran parents, Catholic parents, Southern Baptist parents, atheist. So it was like the full gamut. And I realize now, I think there is more sensitivity around your foster child doesn't have to believe the same thing as you do. But back then, I had to do what my foster parents wanted me to do. So I was constantly learning, every year or two, a whole different faith system to deal with the beliefs and structures and different ways of doing things. And then I went to university in New York City University of New York, Hunter College. I went through there, and I've had kind of a up and down work life because unfortunately, when you've experienced childhood sexual abuse, not only does it affect you psychologically, but it can also affect you physically. And I got some very good psychiatric treatment, but then I had all these physical ailments that just happened to me over the years. And so I've always struggled with that.
And you're not the only one. Out of all of our Visible members, I can't think of one who hasn't been impacted emotionally, psychologically, and physically. And it's the physically that sometimes people don't correlate.
Yeah.
The ailments don't seem to be, starkly or quickly linked to the actual abuse, and it usually comes on later in life.
Yeah. Well, I think because basically I've got a very strong constitution.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with that.
Yeah. When I was born, I actually had things wrong with me. And I was very premature and everything like this. And I had to have braces on my legs and all this stuff. But then once I grew, I was okay. And then I just kind of ignored the physical symptoms. And so when I became older, let's say in my 30s, I could barely bear some things. And unfortunately, I had an incident at my job where he came in with a weapon and held my office manager hostage. Yeah, in East New York, Brooklyn. It was dreadful. And because of that, not only did I psychologically crash, but I also physically crashed. I was watching a movie called Oscar and Lucinda, which is a novel about an Anglican priest in the 19th century who develops a gambling addiction. And then he goes to Australia, which is a colony back then, obviously, as a penance, Oh, I'm going to leave England and go to Australia and, work with the people there because I'm a terrible addict. And it turns out that he falls in love with a woman and he still, wants to gamble and all these things. But I saw that film and it changed my life. I was like, oh my God, I have to become a minister. I have to go help people because in this scenario, Oscar, who has the gambling addiction, he's not helped by his church. In fact, he's cast out. And so I'm sitting there thinking, I have to be the one that's accepting of people. I have to be the one that's accepting that people, do things wrong. And because of that, I then found my faith denomination, which is Unitarian Universalist in America.
Could I ask what Unitarian?
Unitarian Universalist, yes. Well, okay, most people know Trinitarian, right? Trinity means three, tri. So you have Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, or Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Now, Unitarians think of unity, one. So I believe there is one God, and whether or not Jesus is the Messiah is up for grabs. What I basically focus on instead is what Jesus preached, which is love to God and love to your neighbor. And so I kind of feel like if I follow that edict, then I'll be all right. So that's a Unitarian bit. Back in the 1960s, the Unitarians merged with the Universalist, which is even more radical, and that they're a more resoundingly Christian group, but they believe in universal salvation. Nobody goes to hell. And I truly believe that, because if there is an all-loving, all-powerful God, then God is going to fix it. And it is, for me, a comfort, because even though I want to help people, I want to be there for people in their triumphs and their weaknesses. That's one of the beauties of being part of a faith movement that doesn't have a set creed, is when you study as a Unitarian Universalist to become a minister, a pastor, you have to learn about all different faiths. I mean, I know a little bit, what it means to be a Buddhist, what it means to be Muslims. I don't think I'm ever going to practice those things, but it's good to know something about those religions. But I mean, in the American context, you could spend your whole life studying various Protestant sects and still not it be a drop in the ocean. As part of helping with Visible, I did for a while run a peer support group for adult women survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And that was only because when I got involved, there was an NHS conference about childhood sexual abuse. And at that conference, I learned there was no peer group. So I just kind of went around until I found an organization that would sponsor peer group. And so I did that for a while until we lost our funding. I looked up the report only because I know that this issue is not just important in the United Kingdom, it's globally all over the world. The issue of childhood sexual abuse within faith or religious organizations and settings is so important right now. It is really all over the world. So it's called Child Protection in Religious Organizations and Settings, and it's an investigative report. It was published last year by a governmental panel, and it's just goes into a lot of depth. It's very lengthy. It's 200 and something pages long. But some of the things that they talk about, particularly when it comes to some of the barriers we'll talk about later, they're so pertinent, not only to what I've experienced being a professional within a religious context, but also as a survivor of sexual abuse myself. I experienced how people could use faith, traditions, beliefs to keep the abuse from being reported.
And control further and coerce as well.
Oh, yes. And that's the other thing too. The coercion to continue the abuse, it's just hideous when somebody takes something as your belief system and then uses it against you to continue harming you. It's just god-awful.
Which is extremely common.
Yeah.
In order to continue child sexual abuse, coercion has always been there.
Yes. But, I think I was always a kid that really enjoyed life. I'm very extroverted. I like to see the funny side in things. I was always just, I went through this thing. I was like 4 or 5 years old. I remember this. I went through this thing where I decided I was going to skip everywhere. And so I ran around this little town called Cahokia, Illinois, skipping, everywhere. And that was how much fun I enjoyed life until I didn't enjoy life when I was being abused. And, you know, I think you have to come full circle with that, because even though I have experienced this trauma, I still want to be that person that if she feels like it wants to skip everywhere.
I agree.
Yeah. So,
Very good.
yeah. Yeah, it's just, it is amazing the strength of personality that people have. And I found that with a lot of visible members. But I do think that people that have experienced abuse within their faith community or use faith as a justification for the abuse, it's so insidious that it is really hard to overcome. And if people want to choose to lose their faith after they've been abused, I completely understand that too, because when I saw this movie and decided I want to be a minister, it was the last thing on the planet I thought I would do. But how old was I? I was like 30 something years old. And I just knew what I had to do more than anything I ever knew. And the road has not always been smooth, but I've never doubted that this is where my talents lie, being with people, because I've been a chaplain in oncology. I've been a peer counselor for addiction at a major psychiatric center. I've led services in both England and Scotland. I've talked to the Women's League of the Unitarian Association here about childhood sexual abuse. And also I have to say that this is so important because when I gave that talk a few years ago, it was shocking that a minister actually said to me, well, you could have fought him off. And even in this day and age that somebody still had that attitude. And thank goodness I have healed it enough where I could just calmly say, I'm sorry, but you don't know how you would really respond if you thought it was life or death.
And also to remind everyone that you were a child.
Yeah.
You can't control an adult or an adult's behaviors. As a child, you better know your own.
And this was my older foster brother who was much bigger than me, who was much stronger than me. And I just, I wanted to keep peace in the family.
Yes.
But when I did tell my foster parents, who were ardent Catholics, what was going on, it really was, this is your fault kind of thing. I was thrown out of catechism. It was a complete
catechism.
Catechism. That is the instruction to become a Catholic.
Okay.
So when you see people, they say, "Oh, I'm having my first communion." It's after these long weeks of instruction, and the weeks of instruction in the Catholic faith are called catechism. But that was extremely difficult because my mother was the secretary to the parish priest. She was employed by the church. And I think part of why blaming me was a way to deal with it was because then, she didn't have to take responsibility. And I have to say this, that foster brother grew up and became a cop and is now a registered sex offender because he was pulling women over on the side of the road and raping them. So if they would have done something and actually listened to me, they could have prevented, women getting raped as adults. But again, I feel like that's not my responsibility, but it just illustrates why this needs to be done effectively. It's so important because unfortunately some people are predatory, and just because they grow older doesn't necessarily mean they're going to change. I spoke up. Okay, it didn't work, but at least, I did what I could to protect myself and other people.
Yes, you did.
So, but again, it was all about appearances. And see, that is the difficulty when we talk about people of faith and childhood sexual abuse. When you get down to what is more important, stopping the abuse or having a certain appearance of no abuse. And that is when things get not done properly, is when people want to keep up the appearance of perfection.
Yeah. So are you helping the perpetrator or are you supporting the victim?
Right.
Yeah. Which side do you lie on?
Yeah. This dynamic is poisonous to everybody involved in it.
And suppression is the thing that destroys future lives or the lives of the survivor later on.
Yeah.
I always say early intervention is key.
Yeah.
For child sexual abuse.
Yes. And I don't know why it's been going through my mind a lot lately. And it's something that I think people listening might understand. Even though it's not as common, there is this notion that you want to present yourself as respectable. And what does being respectable mean? I certainly think putting up the appearance of being respectable at the cost of honesty never works. And that to me is part of the problem. That the people that I live with while I was being abused that did not want to report what had happened, they were so concerned with appearing respectable, appearing good Christians. And it just, the appearance doesn't matter. What actually matters is how you act.
Yeah.
And I tell people, like, for me, love is an action word. It's not just, oh, I feel a certain way. No, love means I act a certain way. And I certainly think saying and doing things that continue to have harmful effects on people are not helpful, no matter what your faith group is. And I also think people of good faith, it matters not whether you be Christian, Muslim, Jew, Sikh. If you're a person of good faith, of course you want to protect children. We just need to get in habits that promote child protection as much as we can.
And allow children to open up.
Yes.
That's the main key, isn't it? To be that significant, trustworthy person, whether you're in a religion or a position in power.
Well, that's one of the recommendations in the report that I mentioned earlier by the governmental panel, is they talk about how, the abuse of power by religious leaders. But then as a component of that is gender identity and gender politics, and how in many faith groups, women do not have as high a position of authority as men. But in my experience, the more that you can involve both men and women in activities with children, the better the situation's going to be. Like I have always told congregations, look, if you're going to have an activity with children, you need 2 adults. Ideally, you would have a male adult and a female adult. And then, that allows children to have various role models. But I know not every faith group can do that, but that is the safest practice, is really not allowing one person to be totally in charge of children.
Thank you to our members for that discussion, and thank you to all of you for listening to Visible Voices. Please join us again next time, where we will continue on this theme. Toodle pip. Thank you for listening to this episode. We hope you found Visible Voices interesting, thought-provoking and helpful. Visible Voices was created and delivered by the Visible Leadership Reference Group. Special thanks to all those that contributed today. Western Studios Leeds Limited for facilitating the podcast. The music was produced by Mark Parvin, aka Marvin Parks. To find out more about the Visible Project, go to visibleproject.org.uk. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. If the content of this has affected you and you live in Leeds, please go to the child abuse subsection of the Mindwell website, mindwell-leeds.org.uk.